Good evening, everybody. This is Mike Scott from Farm Table Foundation. Good to have you all here for our class with Jenny Breen. Jenny will be starting shortly. I'm sure there'll be a few people coming in the next minute or two, but we're really pleased to see you here. This is only our second class with Jenny, but our first one was great, and I'm sure some of you were a part of that one as well. Really appreciate Jenny's perspectives and experience as an instructor for many years. Also, she's been a chef and a restaurant, working in restaurants as well. She now teaches for University of Minnesota, as well as the Balkan Center for Spirituality and Healing. So, as many of you know, Farm Table's mission is to build local food culture, and we do that in a variety of ways, including through building community, through supporting conservation efforts, partly through simply the kinds of farming that we support, through the kinds of farmers we purchase food from, and then also through teaching the crafts around local food, whether it's gardening and growing food or preserving and putting it up for the winter. So,
thanks, Mike, and hello, everyone. As much Zooming as I'm sure we've all done, it's still a little bit weird to, get used to this teaching format. Not because of me and the teaching that I'm doing, but really because the social interaction is so different. So I can kind of sort of see some of you. A lot of you don't have your cameras on, so I can see your names. And then, of course, when I'm talking, you're all muted. So it's a much quieter class than I normally am used to. As Mike said, I teach at the university. One of the classes that I teach is an undergraduate cooking lab. So it's part of a class in which we have a cooking lab every week. And of course, it's online right now. So I have 25 students cooking at home while I'm in my kitchen watching them. And it's very weird because normally I'm running around and there's people cooking all around me, and I'm just trying to make sure everyone doesn't destroy themselves or their food. And it's so quiet and so strange to just be watching each of them individually cooking. So I'm still getting used to it. So I welcome your comments or questions. As Mike said, go ahead and unmute yourself if you have something to ask anytime. I mean, that would be the case if I was teaching in person as well. I really like to hear what people have to say or what they want to know while we're talking about it, because a lot of times you'll forget or we'll be on to something else. So definitely do that. Also, just any questions about anything, really. The way that I'm going to do this class, so this class is about building a pantry. And I have been teaching cooking and nutrition and culinary nutrition, which is essentially that intersection of nutrition and actually cooking, because believe it or not, in many, if not most nutrition programs, there actually is no cooking as a part of one's training. So when a person learns how to be a dietitian or a nutritionist, they actually know often very little about food and cooking, which is, to me, somewhat extraordinary. And so part of the teaching that I do is actually to people who are in the health fields, who really know that food is related to health and chronic illness especially, but they don't know much about how to guide people to using food as a way of taking care of their health. And in my mind, all food is related to health, whether it's good for your health or not good for your health. And so understanding all of the foods that really serve to promote our health rather than prevent health, and all of the ways in which we can set ourselves up for success around that is really what I teach about. And that is where building a pantry comes in, because the first thing that you need to do in order to really be able to prepare good food for yourself is to have good food on hand. And it's not something that you can do overnight. I mean, I suppose you could. Certainly there are all kinds of reality shows where that's what people do, right? They do a makeover in one day, but that's not really reality for most of us. And so I consider building a pantry a process that takes time and something that we do over time, as we're also building our repertoire and our kitchen skills. And so I like to start by just talking about the various kind of categories that I think you need to have in your pantry to really be able to prepare food. And before I go into it, and I think I'm literally going to pick my computer up and kind of walk around my kitchen to show you some of the places that I have ingredients and how I have them. But before I do that, I'm just going to talk a little bit more generally about kind of, again, where that culinary and that nutrition intersect. So we have 3 macronutrients. And again, please stop me if you at any point have a question or a comment. Normally I would also have everyone introduce themselves, but I didn't even do that tonight. So hopefully maybe we'll have time at the end. Anyway, so there are 3 macronutrients. And it's, in case you don't know, and that's fine if you don't, most nutrition students know this, but it's proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. So that is essentially, that is what every food is made of, is either one or a combination of macronutrients, okay? And then within those, there's all kinds of micronutrients and minerals and, you know, that kind of stuff. But macronutrients are basically the foundation of what food is. And so it's good to understand that, just in the sense that most cooking and most eating and most making of food is combining those macronutrients in some way. So protein is, it's energy, it's strength and muscle building and power, and, you know, it's really important for us to get protein. And there are certain foods that are complete proteins on their own, animal foods, but other foods are also protein high or protein rich, but they have other things in them too. For example, legumes, beans, nuts and seeds, soy products, other, you know, dairy products. Those are all also proteins and really belong in that protein category. But those also include things like carbohydrates and fats, which are great because we need all of those macronutrients. What's important to understand is that we need all of the macronutrients, but we need really high quality, naturally occurring forms of all of them. And so I don't promote a particular diet or eating style as much as I promote a whole foods way of eating and a very plant forward way of eating. So I'm not anti-animal, I'm not pro-vegan, I don't really put a label on the way I like to eat or the choices that I make, but I am very, very committed to eating mostly whole foods, and that means foods that are in their natural form, foods that don't have a label on them, foods that basically you can identify when you look at them as the food that they are. Is someone wanting to ask a question? Okay, so so proteins, and then you've got your carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are in everything except animal products. So carbohydrates are a very broad category, but whole versions of carbohydrates are things like whole grains as opposed to highly processed grains. Starchy foods, vegetables all have starch in them. And so those are carbohydrates too. Again, not only carbohydrates, but quite a bit of vegetables are carbohydrates. And legumes are starchy. They have some carbohydrate in them. So carbohydrates are another big category. Sugar is a carbohydrate. All forms of sugar are carbohydrates. So that includes fruit, that includes honey and maple syrup, and that includes refined sugar. So again, all foods are in that category or in one of these categories, but the spectrum of how whole or processed they are is really what matters. And then fats is another category that I think is honestly kind of my favorite. And that's because fat is not only, again, a macronutrient, something we absolutely need for our health. It lubricates blood flow, it nourishes our brain, but it also makes everything taste delicious, and it creates satisfaction, satiety, so that we don't need to keep eating because we're satisfied from really good high quality fats. And it helps with absorbing the fat soluble vitamins in our food. So fats are really important for cooking, and they're really important for health. In fact, all of these are really important for both. What's fun, or when you get into the creativity, is when you start combining them and figuring out what goes with what. Not necessarily to figure out what is going to be the most nutritious, because I think we get ourselves really in trouble when we try and lead with the nutrition as opposed to leading with flavor and quality. When we go for flavor and quality, we almost always end up with something nutritious. So quality, in my mind, is much more important than quantity when we talk about things like calories or vitamins and that kind of thing. So when I'm cooking and when I'm making a meal, and this is where we'll start to talk about the pantry and what we have in the pantry, I'm thinking about those three macronutrients and then how I'm going to put them all together to make them taste good, right? I'm going to use those flavors, the sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami that exist in food, to combine those ingredients. And so I'm going to always, for me, I start with one, and usually for me it's the vegetables. What vegetables am I going to use? Because the bulk of what I want on my plate should be vegetables. And so I've mostly got my carbohydrates category filled with vegetables. But if I want to add another flavor element, texture element, then I can bring in a whole grain, because that's another part of the carbohydrate equation. I actually cooked up a pot of wild rice. I have a big jar of wild rice in my pantry right now, so I decided to cook that up. And one of the things that I do, and that I will talk about in terms of pantry, is whenever I cook legumes or a grain or anything really, I cook more than I need for just one meal, so that I can use it multiple times. And that is the benefit of having things on hand, is that you can cook them and use them over and over again, which just makes things easier and more interesting. It's a way of getting creative. So I've got my carbohydrates with my whole grain and my vegetables. Then I think about my protein. And again, I don't have to get too worried about protein, because there's a lot of protein in vegetables. If I'm combining good vegetables and a whole grain, I can get a lot of protein that way. So in this country, we actually worry way too much about protein, and we get really focused on protein, and protein doesn't need to be the center of our plate. But I often like to have legumes or nuts and seeds, because they also add flavor and texture. And so I might add, I've got some beans. These are beans. They're called Marfax beans. I get them from the Mill City Farmers Market, from a wonderful Hmong woman who grows heirloom beans here in Minnesota. So that's one thing that's really fun about starting to build your pantry, is you can just go out and explore and see what people have and add them. I don't have to know specifically what kind of beans these are. I just know that they're a really beautiful kind of brownish, maybe in the pinto sort of family. But so say I'm going to put some beans and some vegetables together, and then I get to think about the fat, the fun part, which is gonna conduct the heat and cook everything and tie all the flavor together and maybe turn into a sauce or something like that. And so that's, I have, and I'll give you a tour in a minute, but I have my oils next to my stove where I do my cooking, and I kind of think about which oils I'm going to use for that. So that's kind of the general, very general formula with which I approach most of my cooking and my meals. So I'm going to do a little bit of a tour. Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay, so I'm going to take you back just to look at my shelf. Hopefully you can see this. So this is my open shelf, and I actually chose to have one shelf like this because I really like to be able to see what's on my shelf at any given time. So I don't have a separate room that's a pantry anymore. We redid our kitchen many years ago, and this is what we put in. And so I don't know how well you can see it, but I have a huge assortment of beans and grains and nuts, mostly in these jars. And so those are going to be kind of the daily, the stuff that I'm using quite often in my meals. And I have black-eyed peas, I have some pinto beans, I have barley, I have black beans, I have some lentils, I have cashews, pecans, almonds. I use nuts a lot. I go through a lot of nuts, so I like to have them on hand. I've got rolled oats back there. Can't really see behind there, but I have quinoa and brown rice. Up on top, I actually just taught a tomato canning class to my university students. So I have my canned tomatoes up there. I've got some pickles and some salsa. Most of what I have here is stuff that's very shelf stable. That's going to hang out for a long time on my shelf. And then over here is my stove. And so you can see above my stove, I buy my spices in bulk mostly. Not that you have to do that, but I like to do that. I've just sort of acquired a number of containers over the years. Sometimes I dry herbs or spices from my garden and put them in there. But in any case, I like to have my spices set up right above where I'm cooking so that it's very easy to reach those because I'm using those all the time. And the same thing is true for my oils. So I have 3 kinds of oils that I keep on hand at any given time. Most importantly, I have olive oil. This is a jar. I just pour my oil into this jar, and I like it because it has a really nice top, which releases the oil really slowly. So you can be very chefy with it. I found this in a little shop, which is really sweet. It's just a lid that you can put on a mason jar. And I put my neutral, I usually buy avocado oil for my neutral oil, or sometimes an oil called algae oil, which is an amazing oil that comes from the algae that fish eat, which is why they have such good omega-3 fatty acids. So that's a really high quality neutral tasting oil. And then the third oil that I use is a toasted sesame oil, and that's because I love the Asian flavor profile. So I use a lot of toasted sesame oil. It's not one that I would say is a must have if that's not a flavor that you use very often. Next to my stove, I've got a cord here because we have a light up here by my pot rack. That's not usually there. But next to my stove, I also have maple syrup, also with a nice slow top. And I have balsamic vinegar, and I have soy sauce or tamari. Those are the things that I put next to my stove because I use them a lot. If you don't use, like I said, toasted sesame oil or soy sauce tamari, maybe that's not something you need on the, right next to your stove. Or if you don't use I tend to use balsamic vinegar, not necessarily in my cooking, but I make salads most nights, and so I just have it out. So part of setting up your pantry, in addition to actually selecting the ingredients and placing them in your pantry, is putting them in the most appropriate location for your use. And actually setting up your kitchen in general is really, really important in terms of your ability to cook efficiently and effectively. I think that is something people forget. There's a flow. If you work in a professional kitchen, you completely understand this. There is a logic and a flow to how a kitchen is set up. And if you have random things in random places, or you don't ever know where your spatula is, that's just one more barrier to cooking when you're cooking. And so set yourself up for success, and then of course you'll have a better chance. So there's one more thing I'll show you. Are there some questions, Mike?
Jennifer, we got a couple of questions.
Okay.
I'd like to know what you recommend for shelf life for beans, nuts, oils, and best practices for storage.
That's a really good question. So with dry beans and grains, I give them a pretty long time. I have never run into, with those items, especially in jars that are sealed, I haven't really run into issues. With oils, there is definitely a shelf life, and spices. If I don't go through spices very quickly, then they do get kind of they get old. They get sort of I mean, they're not dangerous, but they lose a lot of their potency. So with oils, I think there's a sort of a 6-month cutoff, or a time that is recommended. I probably go through a jar of olive oil every 2 weeks. So I don't ever get close to having oil sitting out for that long. If you do, or if you think you will, putting your oil in the refrigerator is a great way to deal with that. It should be fine. And if you have oils that you use less frequently, you can do that too. But I just don't ever have oil that's sitting for that. And I don't have any real liquid ingredients that I use that sit for that long. Maybe a few vinegars, but vinegars I don't worry so much about because they are fermented. Nuts, seeds also can go rancid, so that's something to keep track of. And they can also just get really soft. So if you have nuts and seeds, but they're expensive and you don't really want to throw them out. So if you don't know how long you'll use something, start with a small amount. Another thing you can do is keep them in the freezer. If I have a big bag, like if I just bought a big bag for some reason, I'll just put it in the freezer and then just slowly, put it into the jars as I use it, because the freezer will really hold those things and they won't go bad. Another thing you can do if you have some nuts that seem a little bit soft is you can toast them back up in the oven or on the stovetop just to get more crunch out of them. But usually if something is that old, it's probably a little bit rancid. Again, not likely that it's dangerous, but not such a great thing. You'd really rather avoid that. Were there other things on that list?
You kind of addressed this, Jenny, but so oils don't need to be refrigerated, but then also nor vinegars or tamari. So just a little more about the vinegars and tamari, maybe.
Yeah, in general, they don't need to. Again, I use all of the stuff that I have out, I am using constantly. And so it's never sitting for long periods of time. If you aren't using stuff that often, then sticking them in the refrigerators are really, or even just in a cool, dark place, because the light will also affect how quickly it goes bad. So if you aren't going to use it quickly, then, and again, a pantry used to be a cool, dark place. Usually it was in someone's basement or in a separate room. I have a cabinet, a Lazy Susan back there, where I keep other vinegars that I don't use as often. So that gives them a little more time. And I would worry less about those fermented items like the vinegars and the soy sauce than I worry about the oil, because the oil is a fat and it's just got more of a likelihood of ultimately going bad. So anything that's got fat in it, it does have the capacity to go rancid. So that's why we refrigerate our nut butters, our peanut butter, that kind of thing, because it's a fat.
Anne asked, what about coconut oil?
Same thing. I use coconut oil not as often, and so I keep that back in the sort of dark pantry. Coconut oil is solid at room temperature, and so I think it probably is less prone to rancidity than to some of these other oils. But again, same thing. It's a fat, a pretty hearty fat. And so if you aren't going to use it quickly, best thing is just to pop it in the fridge.
And what's a good way to use algae oil, like as a
Yeah,
dressing?
algae oil is just, it's a neutral oil, meaning it has very little flavor. And that's why I use it. There are a few times, not often, where I want a neutral oil. Usually it's for baking, or maybe I'm just trying to kind of brown something and it doesn't need to be, done in olive oil. So that's what I would use it for. Avocado and algae are relatively expensive oils. Other good choices are any nut or seed oils. So something like pumpkin or sunflower oil. What you should stay away from, and I feel pretty strongly about this. It is definitely a cheaper option, but it's cheap because it is such a poor quality oil. But any of the vegetable oils or corn oils that are out there, and usually if you see vegetable oil, that's basically corn or soy. Those are just really low quality oils. Most of them have been processed either by heat or chemical that really changes the actual structure of the oil to make it toxic. It's just a very, very low quality fat. It's not a naturally occurring fat. It's been changed. And so if there's one really good place to invest, it's in a better quality oil. And I'd say if you only had to pick one, of course, olive oil is the most versatile and the best choice. As far as what kind, I literally buy what's on sale when I buy olive oil. So I don't have any allegiance to any particular kind of olive oil. There's a range of flavors, some come from, a lot come from California, some come from South America or the Mediterranean. As long as it's extra virgin olive oil, you should be good. Obviously, if it tastes terrible, something's wrong with it. But any good olive oil is going to be great for most everything.
Great, Jenny. And then one other question came in. How often ideally should you replace spices?
I think about 6 months is the same. I think it's about the same for oils and spices. And, that's probably an estimate. And I do have some that are sitting on my shelf and I realize, wow, I really don't use that spice, or I haven't used it in a long time, and I'll kind of smell it and try it. And, it's not a huge investment. So if I think it's been there for a while, I'll just toss it. I have spices that that are kind of my typical go-to flavor profile. So I use a lot. And then there's just some that I have for whatever reason. Someone gave it to me, or I bought it for a recipe and then I don't use it again. And at some point it's just going to really lose its quality. So you can taste it and find out that way too. And if you don't know what it's supposed to taste like, that might be hard to do. But there should be you should get the essence of that flavor when you taste it. Any other questions?
That's it for now, Jenny.
Okay, a couple more things I'm just going to actually show you. So I do have a cabinet full of canned items. There's a lot of great stuff that can really help facilitate cooking an easy meal. And so I definitely rely on some canned goods. One thing that is a really great thing to have, especially as we are getting away from tomato season here in Minnesota. I mean, I love, love, love fresh tomatoes, but once we are done with tomato season, I don't really like the tomatoes available to us. I don't really think it's worth it to buy tomatoes from California. But we like to make sauces and soups and things like that. And so to have some good canned tomato products are really great. The other thing that I rely on a lot is canned beans. So I definitely cook beans from dry, as I showed you earlier, but having an assortment of canned beans can make the difference between dinner in 20 minutes and dinner in an hour and a half. And sometimes you just don't have an hour and a half,
or you don't have the capacity to cook beans. And so having some things like that on hand, you can throw together a pretty hearty, really healthful and nutritious and filling meal with just something like that. I also do have canned tuna. I'm not a, I don't eat a lot of it, but it's nice to have on hand. Sometimes that's just a great protein option. So, occasionally other things I do have, and I did share a recipe with you that includes coconut milk. I love to use coconut milk. That's another flavor profile that I like to use. And so I have that, and maybe I'll go down. I don't know how well you can see this cabinet, but this is kind of more the vinegars and other bottled items that I was talking about. And I do some baking. So I keep my baking ingredients in that cabinet. And then actually one more thing to look at just over here above, I've got a few things that I have, as committed as I am to local and seasonal eating. Bananas and avocados are very popular in our house. So those are a couple places where I just give in and acknowledge that I'm not eating 100% local diet. However, I think right now, especially, but throughout the year, we can do an incredible amount of incorporating local ingredients into the meals that we make. Produce for sure, but other things like these locally grown beans or the wild rice that I have, or even some other grains. And if you use flour, we have local flour. We actually have a local pumpkin seed oil. We have a local sunflower oil. So we can do a lot more than sometimes we think. And I think, using avocado with a meal that has, 90% other Minnesota ingredients is a really great way to sort of balance the, living in a place where we can have anything we want, but also really trying to support a sustainable local food economy. And so that's kind of the way that I approach things. I try not to be purist or try and tell people that they should be purist, because I think that's more stressful than anything. I mean, olive oil, imagine the day when we have olive trees here, but I don't know if it's going to happen. So, that's a sort of a choice again that we make to choose a really high quality ingredient that's really good for us, and we can still support a local food system. So, that's always just a consideration that I keep in mind. So, are there other questions?
Yeah, one did just come in. Now that farmers markets are essentially over, do you shop at co-ops, order online, or where, especially for some of the specialty items she mentions, like algae oil, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. You can actually buy that. I learned about it from Mark Hyman has a marketplace, and I can't even remember what it's called, but that's how I first learned about it. So yes, mostly I do shop at the food co-ops, and I live in Minneapolis, so we are really, really lucky to have a huge number of co-ops. Pretty much anywhere that you live, you're near one. And I love that, and I love introducing people to the food co-ops, because when you can no longer talk to the producer themselves at a farmer's market, you can, you know that the people who are doing the buying at the co-op are doing that vetting for you. They have certain minimum standards, they have certain parameters that they follow. And so at least that has been followed. And if you have questions, most of the people at the co-ops who do the buying or even are, behind the counter, have a lot of good information. And as a consumer, I consider it my right to get the information that I want about the food that I'm buying. I'm the person paying for it, so I should be able to ask as many questions as I need. That said, not everybody has access to a food co-op. There are a lot of, I think, local grocery stores that are doing what they can. There's places like Farm Table, which is awesome. And so they are supplying other places with food, but they're also building up their marketplace. I do order some things online. I actually started buying from Imperfect Produce last winter. I wouldn't buy produce online if I could get it locally, because that's my priority. But they sell their packaged products that I buy, whether it's oils or mustard or, you know, even some proteins that that they sell. And I like their mission because in addition to selling, you know, decent quality products, they are selling products that would otherwise go to waste. So if you can shop and also feel a little less wasteful while you're shopping, it's kind of a great option. And so it's very affordable too, because everything is discounted because it's either the mislabeled somehow, or it's an extra run that they, you know, it's excess, or the packaging is off, and they do actually try and find stuff that's local. I actually usually get local cheese through Imperfect Produce, and sometimes even local vegetables. So that's how I operate. You know, as much as possible, I try to support the farmers when I can. And we do have some winter markets now here in the Twin Cities. I don't know if there's any where all of you folks are, but that's another thing that I do. And then, of course, some things I don't buy. Like I said, I don't buy tomatoes, I don't buy strawberries, I don't buy things that don't really grow here in the winter. That's just my choice. My kids, unfortunately, had to live through that, but that's how it is. We get to go crazy when it's fresh, and then either we freeze it and we have it frozen, or we take a break. So
A couple other things came in, Jenny. Jen Amel mentioned Thrive Market is a great online.
that's what it is. Yes, that's the one I was trying to think of. That's Mark Hyman's. So that market is the packager of the algae oil that I buy in the co-op. So you can find it online, I imagine, probably for a good price.
Right, and I typed in Imperfect Produce, as well as 110 Keller Avenue North. That's Farm Table's address. And like Jenny said, we are, you know, we do have oil, we do have flour and yeast, some staples as well. Again, as local as possible all the time, but we are becoming a bit more of a local market as well as a restaurant and place to take classes.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff there. So, and I always defer to the people who are working directly with farmers first. So anytime I can do that. And, you know, it is really, there's an ongoing question and conversation about the affordability of healthy food. And it's one I'm very engaged in. I work in a lot of local community food projects as well as at the university. And, you know, the reality is if we are really eating in a way that's most sustainable for the earth and best for our health, that means very little meat, you know, and the meat that we would eat would be high quality, but it means a relatively small amount of meat and a lot more vegetables and whole grains. So that alone is a big cost shift, but it also means that we're investing in our health now instead of paying for it later. Because the truth is, and I work with a lot of people in the healthcare space, you can't get away without paying for it. So you can choose to pay for it when it's yummy, delicious food, or you can choose to pay for it when you're sick and you have to deal with that in the clinical setting. But not eating well will catch up with you, just will. So.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. A couple other questions actually have come in.
Okay.
So, related to carbs, how much is too much?
Yeah.
About fats, what do you advise about fried foods or stir-fried foods that use a good amount of oil? So questions there around carbs and fats.
Great questions. All right. So I remember I said quality versus quantity. So one of the things I teach, one of the classes I teach, I co-teach with a doctor, and we teach graduate health professional students. So students who are becoming nurses and doctors and public health professionals and pharmacists. And they always want us to tell them the numbers, right? How much should we tell people to eat? We won't do that. And the reason is because if you are choosing really good quality carbohydrates, it's virtually impossible to eat too much. You will get full from your squash and your sweet potatoes and your onions and your lentils and your rice before you've had more than you should. So that's the main thing I will say, quality, quality, quality. So if you are eating whole grains, whole foods, really, you know, foods that don't have a label, and those are mainly the carbohydrates, you really will be fine. It's going to be tough to eat too much. Now, if you're eating bread and cookies and crackers and chips, which I don't call junk food. I love that stuff, right? But if that is the majority of where you're getting your carbohydrates from, that's a highly refined version of a carbohydrate. That's a very different thing. So you don't even have to measure that. You can know. You don't even have to know the grams or the number of carbohydrates in that food. You already know that those are basically the wrong carbohydrates. Now, that's not to say that every once in a while or even once a day you should enjoy some of those more refined carbohydrates, as long as the bulk of what you're getting is the other stuff. I love cookies, I love chips, I love crackers, but those are the side part of my meal, right? And then related to fat, I would say almost the same thing. So again, it's about quality versus quantity, because if you're having a naturally occurring, really high quality fat, like an olive oil or like nuts and seeds, those are going to satisfy you and fill you up so that you won't consume crazy amounts of them. As far as fried foods go, again, so put that into every once in a while category, but I'm sure you already know the answer to this question. Eating fried foods, and when we say fried, I'm talking deep fried. That's just, it's just not good for us. And I think if you did that, you would know that. You would feel it, right? Like we all know how we feel when we eat a lot of really deep fried food. Stir frying, that's a really different kind of fried. So we're not deep frying, we're not immersing that food in a really hot oil. And by the way, in order to get oil that hot, you have to have some pretty low quality oil, because the oils that I'm talking about, they're not really high heat oils, because there's really no reason that we should be cooking at those heats. So in order to get something that hot to deep fry, you have to be using an oil that's already low quality. And then on top of that, you're just immersing that food in that oil, so it's absorbing a huge amount of it. So that's not going to feel good. It's not going to satiate you because of the quality. But again, if you're using high quality oils and you're cooking at appropriate temperatures, so I would consider a stir fry appropriate only because you're doing it fast. Stir frying is hot but quick, so it's not like immersed in that oil for a long time. That's a really wonderful, great way of cooking any food. And usually when we're making stir fry, we're including a lot of vegetables. So again, the proportions are right. The two recipes that I gave you tonight, I was thinking I would demonstrate one if we have time. And that is not necessarily a stir fry because it's not so vegetable heavy, but it is a fried meal. And so we can talk about how it is still healthy, even though we're quote unquote frying. More questions?
Yeah, there's one more. Some people seem to think coconut oil is one of the healthiest oils. Can you speak to that? And then isn't coconut oil saturated?
So yes, so coconut oil is naturally saturated. So there's a hydrogenated oil, which is solid at room temperature because it was chemically changed by adding hydrogen to it, which is really different than coconut oil, which is also solid at room temperature, but naturally. So yes, it's a saturated oil, but again, because it's naturally occurring, that's just the way it is. It has not been altered chemically. The quality and the health benefits are still pretty high. As far as whether you should make it your primary oil or your primary fat, I would say I'm not convinced of that for a few reasons. It's always great for us to try and eat what makes sense for us to eat where we are in the world. Now, granted, olives don't grow here either, but coconuts definitely don't grow here. And so a saturated fat in a much warmer climate might make more sense for the foods that you'd be eating and the temperature and environment you'd be eating them in. So I enjoy coconut oil. I enjoy the taste of it. I like to pop my popcorn in it. I like to throw it into a curry sometimes, but it's not my primary oil. But again, it's not an issue because it's saturated, because again, it's naturally that way. So we have to always be looking at how the food got the way it is. And if it got that way because that's naturally how it is, versus did it get that way because somebody went into a laboratory and changed it up? And that makes a big, huge difference, because our body understands something that nature made, right? Our bodies are designed to understand the foods that nature creates. Our bodies don't understand food that we created in a lab, that humans created necessarily. And so it's going to get processed really differently, or not processed. And that's why we have to be concerned about that.
All right, Jenny, you're good. No more questions at the moment.
Awesome. All right. So I'm thinking I will just do this chilaquiles recipe, unless people did, and or I can do the other one, but I'm thinking this one just because that's what sounds yummy to me right now. And I made these beautiful beans. So just for fun, I'm going to turn this a little bit so you can see the stove more.
And then can you change the angle a little bit too, Jenny?
Oh yeah, like
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. How's that? My head might be cut off a little bit. That's all right.
Let's try that. Yeah.
You don't
See what
need
you want to do there. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just gonna grab my oil. So this is a recipe that I love to do for any meal, breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And that's one thing that I also really like to teach when I teach people, is that we have this really funny idea about what breakfast food is and what lunch food is and what dinner food is. And a lot of times when my partner and I are teaching, people say, but what should I have for breakfast? If I'm not supposed to have refined carbohydrates, then what am I supposed to eat, right? Because what do we usually have for breakfast? Bagel or toast or pancakes. I mean, we also have eggs or bacon, which is fine, but you can have anything for breakfast that you would have for lunch or dinner. And that's actually something I really appreciate about other parts of the world. I spent time in South America and Mexico and the Middle East. And for many other cultures, breakfast is another meal that's very vegetable heavy, or that's, you know, cheese or beans or something. And so we need to remember that those are really wonderful breakfast options. And for a lot of us, it's really important to have something that's going to nourish us and sustain us, right? Because many people will have that bagel or that pancake, and then 2 hours later, they're crashing because that has turned into sugar so quickly in our blood that it's not giving us any sustained energy, and it's not giving our brain any fuel. And so this is a dish that is kind of a classic breakfast meal in Mexico. It's called chilaquiles, but I'm making it at 7:30 at night, and it will be yummy then too. The other thing about this is it's a very, very standard sort of template of a meal, but you can adapt it and adjust it any way you want. So I'm going to do the chilaquiles. I have, I think I added a cilantro salsa recipe that I can also do, or I might play around with something else. So we're just going to go ahead with it. I'm going to do some prep. So if you've seen any of my classes before, you know that I will always talk a little bit about knife technique. Very important, first of all, just to have a good knife. It's great if you have a whole set, but really one good knife is better than 5 not good knives, both in terms of efficiency and quality, and in terms of safety. So I have just a basic chef's knife. It's a 6-inch, which is plenty big for me and my hands. You want to make sure it's one piece of steel from one end to the other so that there's no attachment where the handle meets the blade. You want to hold it really firmly, almost like you're shaking hands with somebody. Have a really firm grip on it and really close up to right here where the handle meets the blade, or even some people will hold it on the blade. So you have a nice firm grip, forefinger on one side, thumb on the other. And then I want the tip of my knife on the cutting board, almost like it's attached to the cutting board. So I'm not actually lifting it up and cutting in between. I've been watching a lot of chef shows. That's like what I do when I'm stuck at home. And it's really interesting because, you know, a lot of times they show chefs cutting really fast like this. And I think, oh, I don't actually think that's great for people to see, because that isn't the way most of us work. We don't have to work at that high speed, but it's also really not that safe or that good for the blade. So as long as I'm doing this and I'm just using my elbow, I can just rock back and forth and my blade never has to leave the cutting board. And that is a really effective, efficient way to cut. With this hand, I'm gonna, you know, bend my fingers like a bear claw. Some people use their knuckle as a guide. I like to move my hands a little further back. And then I'm just gonna hold on to whatever I'm cutting. This is just a green onion. I could just use a regular yellow onion, but I have these from my garden, so I'm gonna use that. And if I were using something like maybe a sweet potato or a squash, the first thing I would want to do is create a flat edge, because when I have something big and round, it's really especially dangerous for me to try and cut it without having more stability. So in this case, this is pretty soft and pretty smooth, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. So I'm just going to cut my onions. And with this, I'm going to go all the way up to where the greens are. Every part of this onion is delicious. If I was using a leek, which is like a big giant green onion, then that dark green part gets pretty tough and fibrous, not so enjoyable to eat. So I probably wouldn't cut it all the way up, but I would save it because then I can use it for soup stock. So you always want to get as much as you can out of your vegetables. That's another way to get more bang for your buck, literally. So I'm gonna get my stuff prepped before I start cooking. I have some corn tortillas, and these, I usually keep these in the freezer just because it's really easy to take them right out of the freezer and then cook with them. We make quesadillas a lot in our house. And they come apart actually really easily when they're frozen. It's a little hard to cut them when they're frozen solid, so I took these out at, you know, half an hour ago, but these are going to get cut up and fried into the dish, kind of like making your own chips. So these are really thick corn tortillas, so I maybe won't do them all at once just to be safe. And I'm going to just cut them. You can cut them in strips. You can cut them in triangles. Doesn't really matter, however you want, but just kind of a, you know, chip size. They're not going to get crispy and crunchy all the way through like a chip, but parts of them will. So they'll be somewhat chewy and somewhat crispy in parts. And that's kind of what I want. So I'm going to get those all ready. And then often this is served with eggs, cheese. Often there's meat. Usually when I think about in Mexico, you'll go to some place and then you can sort of add whatever sort of things you want to your chilaquiles. So it's just tortillas and beans and onions and spices, and then you can add your meat or your eggs or the other things. So I've got my beans, my onions. I'm gonna do some garlic. Whoops, so I have, I'm gonna do a couple cloves of garlic. And in case you aren't familiar with this trick, you wanna take your clove, I put my knife down just sort of on top of it and bang it. And then usually I should be able to just pop my clove right out of the skin. I know I used to spend a lot of time trying to get all that skin off with my fingernails, and it was sticky and it would get stuck under my nails, and I never knew that trick. And then when I learned it, I couldn't believe it. So this is another situation where I'm mincing, I'm cutting something really small. So I could, because I am pretty experienced, I'm comfortable holding my garlic and doing this. But another way to mince something is to take my hand and put it on top of my knife and just go back and forth, kind of scrape it. That's a really easy way to mince it. You see, I'm still not picking my knife up off. I have metal bowls under here. That's the noise you hear, and I can just go back and forth as much as I want to get my garlic as minced as I want. It's a great way to do, like if you're mincing herbs, something like that. So I've got that, and then I have a little cheddar cheese. I need to grab a grater for that if I want to put that in. Another kind of cheese, I think that's the one that's on the recipe, I call cotija, which is just that Mexican sort of soft, crumbly white cheese. A feta would work, or a goat cheese, any cheese you like, or none at all. I know if you're out in the Amory area, you guys have a few really amazing cheesemakers out there. So I always, as I say, like to try and find local suppliers. And if you live in Minnesota or Wisconsin, you almost have no excuse not to eat local cheese, because we have so much good dairy here. So I get that ready. And then I can do the, I think I'll just talk through the cilantro salsa. Cilantro salsa, just very simple. It's kind of similar to a chimichurri. It's just a basic green sauce. So I use just sort of a mini food processor, like a coffee grinder. We have one in our house that's just for spicy things, and then a different one for coffee. You could also use a food processor, or I have an immersion blender, which has a little food processor attachment. You could use a blender, or you could actually do it by hand, and it would just be a little thicker. So you basically just taking your cilantro, throwing garlic in, a little bit of lime juice, or if you don't have lime, lemon, some kind of acid. Lime is sort of the flavor profile with all of the Latin flavors, but vinegar is another kind of acid. You know, all of the cooking that we do is sort of, again, that balancing of the fat and the acid and the salt and the sweet. You know, that's kind of what we're playing with, is those different combinations. And I enjoy all those flavors, but it's really a matter of just balancing them out and combining them in the right amounts. But so that would be the simple way to do it. I'm going to, just like I did with the garlic, I'm just gonna mince this cilantro and just throw it in my dish that way. And maybe grab some lime just to squeeze on top. Very classic, when we have tacos or enchiladas in our house, we'll squeeze a little lime on top. So it's really fun when you start looking at different cultural foods, and you can see the sort of same formulas playing out with different ingredients, you know? So if you look at Asian food, you've got the toasted sesame oil, you've got the ginger and garlic, you've got lime. You look at Latin food, you've got beans and corn, and you know, so their carbohydrate or their whole grain is their corn, whereas in Asian food it's rice. You know, in African food maybe it's millet. So everybody has these components in their food. It's just different specifics, and that's why I think when you have a pantry, the more you start adding different options, it isn't so much I don't have what I need, it's which combination am I going to make? One of the things I do with my students a lot is I might have a recipe for them, but I will not have every single ingredient in the recipe. And so they'll have to figure out what the function of a particular ingredient is. Well, it's supposed to have lime, but we don't have lime. But what do we have? We have lemon, we have rice vinegar, or we have apple cider vinegar. Which one will work best with what I'm making? So almost all ingredients have some kind of a function. But if we don't have one of those ingredients, there's probably many other things that will work. So that's another reason that having a pantry makes it really possible to just expand your repertoire, because you're not tied to just these narrow lists of ingredients from recipes. And I love recipes. I have a cookbook. I love it when people buy my cookbook and use my recipes. But ultimately, my real goal is to give people the ability to cook without one, and just to sort of look at what you have and think about those components. What vegetables and what whole grains and what carbohydrates do I have? What proteins do I have? And then what fat is going to tie it all together and make it complete. So right now, I'm going to heat my pan. Another thing I'll talk a little bit about is pans, because in addition to having the ingredients in your pantry, having the right tools is also really important. So I love to cook with cast iron. That's almost exclusively what I have. And I love it because, so I'm getting my pan hot. I love it because it's really heavy duty, because it improves with age, which is so rare. It's rare that we buy a tool or something that actually gets better the more we use it, but that's the case with cast iron. It actually also leaches iron into your food, which is a great perk. And it's just it holds heat really well. So if you use it well, it can work as a non-stick pan. It can work for stir fries like a wok does. It can work for anything. You just have to learn how to use it. So the pan is hot, and now I'm putting oil in, and you can see I'm being pretty generous with the amount of oil. And I'm going to throw my onions in, because I know that since the pan was hot, the oil is hot, so I don't need to give it a lot of time to heat up. I'm not going to throw my garlic in right away. I want the onions to get a little bit cooked before I throw the garlic in. And that is because garlic will burn really easily, especially when it's this small. So I don't want that to happen. I want it to be more like another ingredient.
Jenny, related to the garlic, do you ever use garlic presses?
You know, I don't own one. People ask me that all the time. I think it's fine, but there's something about cutting the garlic and having control over the size of the pieces that I like. Sometimes I want big chunks or slices. Sometimes I want little pieces. If you want to get the liquid out of the garlic, then a press can help with that. I don't have any real issues with them. I just don't ever find that I need one. But a lot of people like them. And so now I'm going to throw my tortillas in. So I just threw the garlic in, and the tortillas are going in too. And I may decide that I want even more oil, because I want these to be coated enough that they will start to crisp up a little bit. So I'm going to do just a little bit more oil. And the trick is keeping the pan hot enough to get everything crispy and cooked, but not so hot that it's going to burn, right? Because again, we're not deep frying, but we are using hot oil. So as soon as I notice that these tortillas are starting to soften and wilt a little bit, that's basically the texture that I want. So I'm going to throw beans in, and my cilantro. And I think that recipe calls for salsa, so I'm going to grab some. I happen to have some that was gifted to us that's homemade, so I'm going to use a little bit of that, but not until I get close to the end. I'm going to do all the beans. What the heck? The other thing I'm gonna do, I don't actually have my grater, which is fine, I could grab it, but I'm just as fine, just kind of mincing up my cheese. I do this a lot. Maybe I'm lazy, but I just figure it works just as well. My cheese will melt just as well if I just chop it up. So, and I definitely want to add salt. Another thing I can add is spices like cumin or chili powder, which I have to go around here to grab because I'm pushed up against the wall here. But I'm gonna add a little cumin, one of my favorite spices and definitely good with Mexican or Latin flavored food. A little bit of chili powder. And often when we're cooking, we want the spices to go in with the oil so that that oil will distribute them and cook them and really bring out the aroma. Because those spices really need to sort of be drawn out, right? Then I'm gonna do my salsa, not a lot. Kind of a spicy one, so I'll go a little easy. Try and get that distributed. And then my cheese. And I think if you want, again, I throw some sweet potatoes in would be really delicious. If I was gonna do that, I would probably steam them first so that they would be nice and soft. Throwing broccoli or kale in, I do that a lot with a dish like this. So anytime that I see an opportunity to add vegetables, I will. This is right now a wonderful and delicious meal, but it's very hearty. There's not a lot of vegetables in it. So either I would serve this with a salad or like I said, I would get vegetables in there. So one of the ways that I think it's easiest for us to change that balance of the carbohydrates to, you know, or the produce and the vegetables to all the other heavier, starchier things is to just always add them. Any chance we get, unless it's a fruit salad, you know, just take an opportunity to throw vegetables in. And so, and my kids, you know, again, that's been their experience. They've had no choice but to have everything with a ton of vegetables. In fact, they laugh a lot. They're older now, they're teenagers, but they talk about how nobody they know eats the way that we do, because in our house, most of what's on the table is vegetables. And it's delicious and it's filling, but you're getting filled up with some wonderful whole grains and some wonderful other proteins and a lot of vegetables. And that's a really, for me, a really enjoyable way to eat too, because then I get to eat big mounds of food, you know, which I love. So then you don't really have to worry about eating little amounts. So let's see, I'm gonna grab this.
Jenny, we have a question here about if you use a can of beans, do you drain the liquid inside first and then rinse the beans as well? Or?
Yeah, so yep, that's a great way to do it. I usually just pour them into like a strainer like this, you know, or you can just, if you have a colander, if you don't have a colander, you can just use the lid and drain them. It's not a bad idea to rinse them. Sometimes they have salt added. That's a really important thing about canned foods that I didn't mention, but really important to take a look at the ingredients and make sure that what you're buying doesn't have added sugar or salt. Anytime you buy anything in a package, and canned beans are, or canned anything is a package, just make sure and take a look, because it's very likely that something has been added either for flavor or preserving. So rinsing it is a great way to get at least some of that off. And then of course, if you buy stuff that doesn't have salt added, you're in good shape.
And then someone had a question about cleaning your skillet, especially if you've, using something that sticks like eggs, or
Yeah.
some advice on that.
You know, it's really, really easy. So first of all, I don't clean my skillet every time I use it. I will admit that to you all. If I can get most of the food out, then usually I feel like, it's all good. And so unless I'm trying to do something that requires absolutely non-stick surface, a lot of times I'll cook a few times in my pan before I clean it. The easiest way to clean it that I've found is just to soak it in hot water for even just 5-10 minutes, and that loosens up whatever might be stuck on it. And then I use just a scrubby, a green scrubby, or steel wool sometimes, although you don't need anything that abrasive that often. And then just hot water. And then we put it back on the stove and turn on the heat just to dry it. So I don't always season it with oil. If it looks to me like it's getting a little dry, like maybe starting to look a little bit rusty, then I will add a little bit of oil and just wipe it on with a cloth or a paper towel. But usually it's just hot water and a scrubby. I have read more recently that soap is not really as bad as we've been led to believe, but because I'm in the habit of not using soap with my cast iron, I don't find that I need it. And I mean, most of the cast iron I have is probably 20 or 30 years old at least. Some of it came from antique stores or thrift stores. I did buy one new, and it's probably taken about 5 years for me to get it to a point where I feel like it feels good and seasoned and not really raw anymore. So from my perspective, the older the better. And I have bought, last year I was at a thrift store and found a gorgeous cast iron skillet just in the pile of skillets, and it was maybe $20. And it just needed a little bit of cleaning. It was incredible. So people, for some reason, sometimes people get rid of them. They don't really think they're great. And even if it's rusty, you can bring them back. I'm looking to see, is there another one?
Yeah, someone just said salt is also a good abrasive. Norma mentioned that.
Yeah, salt works too if you are in a situation where you don't have any other options. The other thing I will say though is you can use a cast iron skillet without sticking. And this is something I teach my students even when we're not using cast iron, which is a lot of times the reason that things stick is because we're cooking them at too low of a heat. And I know I've come to understand after years of teaching that people are really, really timid with heat. And I have a professional style stove, and so it has a really big flame, and of course I've worked in restaurants, and so I'm used to that. But if you're not, a lot of times you'll keep it really low because you're worried that it's gonna stick. When really, an omelet's a great example of this. If you keep it low, it will definitely stick. But if you get it really hot and you get that fat hot, not burning, but hot, then it's going to actually create a layer of sort of heat and friction between the pan and the eggs, and it won't stick. It will be fast, and you have to be ready to sort of do that flipping quickly. But that is actually the trick a lot of the time when you're trying not to make things stick. So keep that in mind, that actually sometimes you need more heat. So any other questions?
Don't see any at the moment, Jenny.
Okay, I'll just, I'm not gonna but I will talk about the other recipe that I sent out just because it's really yummy and I encourage people to try it. But again, so you saw what I did there. That took maybe 5 minutes for the whole thing to come together. And if I had a salad, obviously I had to have the ingredients and I had to cook the beans. But let's say I didn't cook the beans and I had canned beans. So that's a pretty quick meal. And versions of that can happen pretty quickly. The other dish I have is it's a squash and red lentil dal. So it's a really fun fall recipe that maybe isn't necessarily traditional, but it highlights some really wonderful seasonal foods from this part of the world with something with flavor profiles and with an ingredient that comes from very far away. Red lentils are lentil in the lentil family that cook really, really fast and get really thick and creamy. So they don't stay whole like most beans or legumes. They turn into mush, which is why they make dal, which is sort of a creamy, soupy side dish. And so people often ask about peeling the squash. This recipe, you can use sweet potatoes or squash, or you can use both. I generally don't peel my vegetables unless it's winter squash. Otherwise, the peels are good for you. They have fiber, they have vitamins. There's no reason to take them off. You do want to clean them, but that's all. But with the winter squash, it's pretty tough to eat the peel. And so I usually will cut with butternut. It's particularly easy, which is why I use it a lot, because then I get a nice flat edge like this. And then I will usually use my knife to peel it. You don't have to use that. You can, if you have a good peeler, that will work too. And then I will peel it and cut it into cubes and then cook it until it's soft. So in this recipe, you create all the flavors. You've got your garlic and your ginger and your turmeric and cumin and all those spices. You get those going with the oil at the beginning. Then you throw your squash and your water in and cook that down, and then your lentils in to cook. So it all sort of builds on itself. And then of course the coconut oil, coconut milk, which is another really wonderful, naturally occurring fat and delicious flavor. So you've got your protein, you've got this wonderful fat, you've got some carbohydrates in here, you've got some carbohydrates in here, those wonderful orange vegetables with all that vitamin A that you can absorb with the fat from the coconut milk. So there's all kinds of magical things going on here. You don't have to think about it in that complicated way, but that's the sort of underlying strategy or formula that puts all these wonderful flavors together. So if you start looking at just for an experiment or for an exercise, start looking at some of your recipes that way and think about, where am I getting the nutrients, where am I getting the fiber, where am I getting the protein, where am I getting the fat. It's kind of fun to see what is doing what in a recipe, what's providing which function, and then how you can play around with that. And the more things you have in your pantry to do that, the more you can play around. So that's what I have to say about that. Any questions, or I can do a little self-promotion about my book. I'm going to grab a copy of it really quick. I sell my cookbook. It's called Cooking Up the Good Life. I wrote this, I owned a restaurant from 1996 to 2001 and a catering business for about another 15, 20 years, and did a lot of recipe creation then. A lot of those recipes ended up in the book, along with some tips, a lot of tips for getting, especially young people, but anyone really engaged in helping prepare food. One of the things that I know to be true is that the more people are involved with the preparation of their food, the more likely they are to eat it and enjoy it, especially kids. And that's a really wonderful, great environment to start creating when you have little kids, but really at any age. So there's just a lot of tips in here for that. After my last class, we were sort of like, how am I going to get this book to people? And I ended up mailing it, which was really not difficult for me to do. So if people are interested in the book, you can either Venmo me or PayPal me or send me a check, and I will mail the book to you, and then I'll sign it too. So happy to, you can buy it on Amazon. I don't know if it's any cheaper to do it that way, but it's definitely my preference to mail it to you for myself. So.
And Jenny, it's called Cooking Up the Good Life, correct?
Cooking Up the Good Life, yep.
And what was the name of your restaurant and where was it?
The restaurant was called The Good Life Cafe. and the catering company was Good Life Catering, so that's the name. It was on 36th and Grand Avenue in South Minneapolis. Really fun little spot. Doing farm to table before that was an actual thing anybody said. That was really where I learned about the local producers and farmers and how amazing our food system is here.
Does anybody have other questions? Again, you could feel free to unmute yourself at this point if you'd like, or else type it in there and I'll convey it to Jenny. We've got a few minutes left if you have any lingering questions.
And Mike, also, or I can just say my email address. That might be the easiest way for people to reach me if they want a cookbook.
Jenny Broccoli with 2 C's, right?
Yes, just like the vegetable. Sometimes I say like the vegetable and people look at me like, I don't know how to spell the vegetable. So 2 C's, 1 L. And the cookbook, I think I saw someone asking, it's $20. So when people have asked me to mail it, I've asked them to pay $25 to pay for the postage.
Great. So folks, you could be in touch with Jenny. I just typed it in there, jennybroccoli@gmail.com, to get a copy of the book, $25, and she can mail it to you. So feel free to be in touch with her directly or with me too, and I can get you in touch with her if you miss her.
They want to see the chili killies. I put them out there and then I put them back. So there they are. And the cheese, it's still pretty hot. That's the other thing I love about cast iron is I turned this off 10 minutes ago, but it's still steaming hot in here. So the cheese is just nice and soft. I've got, you can see pieces of the salsa and the cilantro. It's really pretty. It'd be really pretty with more vegetables or eggs. It's really versatile. So yeah, kind of like a deconstructed quesadilla. All right, any last questions or anything I can answer? I'm also really happy, now you have my email address, I'm really happy to answer questions. I understand that, an hour and a half is a kind of information overload. So if something came up later, or if you're in the middle of something and my family does it all the time. In the middle of cooking something, they'll say, hey, I need something. So call me or email me. I'm pretty quick to respond.
Well, Jenny, please know that a number of people are saying thank you and for all your wisdom and generosity. So,
good.
And she's, my sister Lynn actually says, are you teaching more classes? And
talking about one in December.
Yeah, we will be talking with Jenny about doing some more for sure. It's interesting right now, she's actually teaching a class with us in a group in Amory area called Kinship of Polk County, teaching a mentor and the mentee together, pairs. And the food is coming from us at Farm Table. We're putting bags of food together from the farms, and the mentors pick that up and then they take it home and cook it with Jenny and their mentee together. It's a neat model.
Yeah, it's a really neat model. I love it. I think it's a great way to cover a lot of different things. Cooking together and community and good food. I will say, for those of you who are looking for classes in the near future, I'm teaching 3 classes through the Center for Spirituality and Healing that are public classes. So I can send you a link, Mike, or if you just go to if you just Google Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing, it's a mouthful, but it's at the University of Minnesota. So those will be just like this. They'll be live Zoom classes. I think we have a few daytime and a few evening, but you're welcome to check those out as well. Oops.
I just typed that in there, Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing. Appreciate
I'll just add to my website, transformingthetable.com, and all of the classes that I'm teaching should be listed there as well. And that's another way to reach out to me if you have any questions too. So transformingthetable.com. Yeah.
And yeah, someone also had an interesting comment. We need more of this kind of thing. I'd love to see in the future a pantry for those who are homeless and taking food stamps and might not know how to cook wholesome foods. And yeah, Jenny, that's definitely been part of your life and your emphasis too. Is how to,
Yeah,
you
you're
know,
right. There's
make
no
good
reason
food
we can't,
accessible.
yeah, sorry, there's no reason we can't be making this kind of food accessible to everyone. That's a mission of mine. I do what I can to try and make that happen too. Yeah, it's not for lack of resources. I'll just say that.
So friends, I'll also, we're recording this, so I'll edit out the beginning part, a little bit of the things that might have gotten in the way, and send that out shortly, probably tomorrow or Thursday or so. I'll resend the recipes in case you didn't get them. So I'll be in touch with you soon related to this class. And then of course, as you all know, probably we have classes almost once a week, depending, but for example, we've got a class coming up on coffee and climate change. You know, our mission is about supporting conservation and supporting local food, but most of us drink coffee. So if we're going to drink coffee, you know, what kinds of coffee actually support farmers and pay them a fair wage? What kinds of, and how is it grown in a way that doesn't contribute to climate change and might actually sequester carbon in the soils? That kind of question and perspective is something we try and bring to our work as well. So that's just one example of an upcoming class that's a little different than maybe some of our typical baking or cooking classes. So a broad range of things coming up on our website in terms of upcoming classes that you can take advantage of. So please check us out at farmtablefoundation.org or be in touch with me.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everything you guys are doing.
Well, thank you, Jenny. It's been great to have you again as an instructor, and we'll do it again, folks. Keep an eye on our website for when Jenny's teaching next, or check out her classes at the Bakken Center coming up soon.
Yep.
And our foundation name, someone asked, is Farm Table Foundation, farmtablefoundation.org. So thank you, everybody. We appreciate your time tonight and joining us. Thank you, Jenny.
Thanks, everyone.
Wish you all well. Good night.